And now we go and we do what would be called the down pose or passing pose in our workflow. And you see that almost automatically the down pose is made for us. Very similar, not perfect, but very similar. So let's get down to it and see what we can do to improve it. So first of all, let's set a key on the foot so that we have it there, and we maybe roll back to 0 and toe raise back to 0 and toe wiggle to 0 as well. So remember, we are flat on the floor in there. There you go. And maybe that means that in the kickoff we can set the wiggle to 0 as well. I forgot it on. I'm so clumsy today. So there you go. I am going to reset the toe wiggle all the way through. So practically the foot self-animated itself. The one part that won't fix itself usually is the hips. In fact, if you lower your weight a little bit, what happens in real life is that the leg supporting the weight, the right one in this case, is going to stay relatively straight, right? Which means it's going to push up the hip on each side. So that means that you will have the feeling that the hip is going down on the side which doesn't lift any weight. So now you see that as I touch the floor and the leg pushes to support the weight, the hip is pushed up. You don't really want to do too much of this thing because we don't want too much hip motion in a run. Remember, the focus is forward movement and run. We don't want to waste excessive energy in unnecessary hip swinging. So I'm going to check that the hip is pushed up on the right side, and maybe I'm going to reduce the swing on the kickoff pose. There you go. Now let's have a look at the arms. The arms are going to be tricky on this one. See how in the reference, the right arm is bent quite a lot more already. So I think I can grab the elbow and just lift it up a little bit on its correct anatomical axis. Then I can grab the arm itself and just move it forward a little bit. But you see how the elbow is on the inside, so that means that the arm needs to be twisted a little bit this way, and we need to move it forward so that the elbow is leading the motion. You see that one of the most notable differences between frame 1 and 3 is that the elbow was behind on frame 1 and it's leading. So we have an inversion, if you think of it, of the arm rotation. And that inversion needs to start from the shoulder control. I mean, you could go as far as doing something like this, but that would be crazy. So there you go. Now we have that inversion. That's maybe a bit too much. Something like this will work, I guess. Now let's have a look at what happens to the left arm. In the animation we're using as a reference, the elbow on the left arm stays relatively outside while ours goes a lot to the inside. So I'm going to move this guy relatively outside. Also, the bend in the elbow doesn't seem to be so marked, so I'm going to reduce that bend. And remember, the wrist moves up a little bit, so I'm going to move the wrist up a little bit. There you go. That means that probably the shoulder will go down a little, I guess, on that side. I'm just guessing here. In general, when the hips go up in one direction, the chest goes down in that direction. But we want to have something very little. We don't want it to look too awkward. And maybe we can do it with both controls for the spine, a little bit this way. There you go. You could even go and overlay your character on top of the girl character you're using as a reference and enable the X-ray geometry just to see whether you're getting the main changes right. I mean, we are not really tracing stuff in here, but I think it's a good idea, especially as you learn, to learn from the best animators and just see what's the timing, because it's not trivial. I remember the first time I had to animate a character breathing, I thought, well, how hard can it be, right? I mean, it just needs to breathe in and exhales, right? The problem was that I didn't know the first thing about breathing, exhaling, inhaling. I didn't know anything about that really. I didn't even know how long it took. But when I had that first shot that I had to animate, I realized how little I knew about breathing. So I think it's a good idea to just have a look at your references and see how your animation lines up to the references, if it does, and whether there is something that you could improve on. And if you think of it, we are quite spot on in there, except there is one thing that I don't quite like in my animation, and that is between the up pose and the contact pose. You see that in here the leg goes down quite a lot. That's the main motion, right? Everything goes down. While our character feels a bit stiff, it doesn't quite feel like the leg is going down. So I think we need to do something about that. And that something could be to grab both the feet and the root control and just move everything up a little bit. And then for the foot which is leading, the left one, I'm going to lift the foot a little bit more, move it forward a little bit more, so that the motion on the way down, you see, will be a bit more pronounced. So sometimes you need a stronger movement towards one direction, but you can't change the landing pose because that's set, right? I mean, you can't go under the ground, can you? That means that if you want to see the transition to that pose from the previous one, you change the previous one so that the transition becomes better, so that you can create more contrast. Then I can also, I guess, relax the hip a little bit. In terms of the animation of the right arm, I can maybe lower it a little bit and then grab the elbow and raise it even more so that the elbow stays there. You see, in practice, the wrist of the character in the reference is moving down as well. So maybe I could move the elbow again, move it down ever so slightly so that the wrist moves down as well, and maybe just lift the wrist up a little bit more in there. There you go. The left arm in this contact is doing quite some rotation on the wrist if you think of it. So maybe I could introduce a little bit more of that rotation and lift up the elbow a little bit. Remember, on its correct anatomical axis only. There you go. So that gives me a similar motion. Now, of course, I changed the contact pose, remember? And whenever you change the contact pose, you have to select all the controls involved. I will select them all, and then mirror the pose on the opposite side. Now, if you use a tool like Animbot, there is a way for you to tell the software to automatically mirror the poses of a loop. But as I said earlier on, this is a paid-for plugin, so I can't assume that everybody watching this tutorial will have it. So I'm going to do this with the basic tools that I find around for free. So let's duplicate that pose and mirror it. So middle mouse drag 9 over to 1, hit S to set a key. Now 1 and 9 should be exactly the same pose, and on frame 1 I'm going to go into Red 9 animation and mirror the pose. There you go. Now I'm going to check the animation there. If you enable the step preview in here, you will notice something funky. That something funky is that the rotation of the foot changes. This is due to the way the rig computes. I could not find a solution to this problem. This seems to be an incompatibility issue between Maya Step Preview and this rig in particular, but we are not so concerned about it. So with all the controllers selected, we are going to set a key on every single pose so that we don't accidentally change these poses. And now it's time for us to mirror the poses. So I'm going to shift left mouse drag over the timeline to select my keys, right click and copy, and then go over the next keyframe I will have to insert, which is 2 frames after the last one on frame 11, and right click and paste. That's going to paste the pose that we have earlier on. That means we have to mirror them, but that's easy. We mirror the pose, mirror the pose, mirror the pose, and that's done. And at the end, if you want this to loop, we go to frame 1, duplicate it over to 17, and the animation will loop just fine. Now, if we want to check this animation in step without the step preview, because remember the step preview is going to change the position and the look of my feet, see that? We are going to need to select all keys by double clicking with the left mouse button on the timeline, right click on it, and then we're going to go tangents and stepped. At the end of the day, if you think of it, the only tangents we really used was some linears on the feet, so we can restore them, don't worry too much about that. If we now play back between 16 and 1, we don't want to play 17 because that would be repeating one keyframe, right? So as I press play, there you go, we have our worried run. Not too bad indeed. And it didn't take long at all if you think of it. Starting from here, we have 2 routes. One is to go and keep the animation on 2s. So just the way it was animated originally, we keep a pose for 2 frames. That's going to look probably better than refining this animation, I think. The other one is to refine it. So I will first have a pass at fixing the poses a little bit and see if there's anything that I have to fix in there. Then I will show you how to keep it on 2s like the original animation. And after we are happy with that result, we're going to see how this could be converted into smooth 3D animation. So every single frame is different. And you're going to see that the moment we move to the traditional CG look, it's not going to look as cool as it looked when it was on 2s. I think there's some magic in the animation that happens on 2s, and it is probably due to the fact that the frames get impressed in your brain a bit longer, so they make for stronger posing and emotion.